In the annals of ancient history, few dynasties match the Ptolemies for their calculated cruelty and systematic perversion of family bonds. For nearly 3 centuries, they ruled Egypt not as pharaohs bound by Egyptian custom, but as Macedonian conquerors who twisted power into an instrument of familial violence. Among their most tragic figures stands Cleopatra, a queen whose life embodied the very worst excesses of absolute power corrupted by blood obsession. The story of Cleopatra VIII is not merely one of personal tragedy. It is a window into how political necessity can transform human relationships into instruments of terror. Her reign spanning much of the 2nd century BC reveals the true cost of maintaining power through bloodline purity. What emerges from the historical record is a portrait of a woman trapped within a system that demanded she sacrifice her humanity to preserve her throne. This is not the glamorous tale of her more famous descendant Cleopatra VII. This is a darker story, one that historians have long hesitated to tell in its full brutality. It is the story of how royal incest became not just accepted practice, but a weapon of political control. It is the story of children murdered by their fathers, of daughters married to their stepfathers, of brothers who became husbands and then enemies. The relevance of Cleopatra II's story extends far beyond ancient Egypt. Her life demonstrates how absolute power, when combined with ideological extremism, can transform even the most basic human institutions into engines of horror. In an age when we continue to grapple with authoritarianism and the abuse of power, her story serves as a chilling reminder of where unchecked authority leads. Today we examine not just the facts of her reign, but the psychological and social mechanisms that made such horrors possible. We'll trace how a civilization's greatest achievements can coexist with its most appalling crimes. And we will see how one woman's suffering became emblematic of an entire dynasty's moral collapse. The evidence for Cleopatra II's story comes from multiple ancient sources, including the writings of Polybius, Diodorus Siculus, and Josephus. Archaeological evidence from the period corroborates many of the most disturbing details. This is not myth or legend. This is documented history as reliable as any from the ancient world. As we begin this journey into one of history's darkest royal courts, we must remember that behind the political calculations and dynastic strategies were real human beings who suffered, loved, feared, and died. Cleopatra's sect was many things: queen, sister, wife, mother, victim. But above all, she was a woman whose life was shaped by forces that reduced human relationships to political transactions. The Ptolemaic dynasty began with Ptolemy VIII, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, who claimed Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. Unlike other successor kingdoms that gradually adopted local customs, the Ptolemies maintained their Macedonian identity with an almost religious fervor. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, alongside Egyptian deities, and most crucially, they married exclusively within their own bloodline to preserve what they believed was their divine right to rule. By the time of Cleopatra II's birth around 185 BC, this system had been in place for over a century. Sibling marriage had become not just tradition, but state policy. The Ptolemies believed that their royal blood contained divine essence that would be diluted by marriage to outsiders. This ideology transformed incest from taboo into sacred duty, creating a closed system where political power and family relationships became indistinguishable. The practice served multiple political functions beyond ideology. In a kingdom where succession disputes could tear apart the realm, limiting marriage, partners to immediate family members, reduced the number of potential claimants to the throne. It also prevented the rise of powerful noble families who might challenge royal authority through marriage alliances. The Ptolemies had learned from the chaos that followed Alexander's death when competing claims destroyed his empire. Egypt in the 2nd century BC was a kingdom under pressure. The rising power of Rome cast an ever-growing shadow over the Mediterranean, while internal rebellions plagued the Egyptian countryside. The native Egyptian population had never fully accepted Ptolemaic rule, viewing the Greek-speaking dynasty as foreign occupiers. Economic problems, including inflation and declining agricultural productivity, further destabilized the kingdom. Into this volatile environment was born Cleopatra II, daughter of Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra I. She was raised in Alexandria, the magnificent capital her ancestors had built as a showcase of Greek culture. In Egypt, the city housed the famous library and museum, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. Yet, beneath this veneer of cultural achievement lay a court where children were raised to view their siblings simultaneously as potential spouses and potential threats. The young Cleopatra, too, would have been educated in the arts of rulership, learning Greek literature, rhetoric, and statecraft, but she would also have learned the dynasty's darker lessons, that family members were the most dangerous enemies, that love was a luxury no ruler could afford, and that survival required the willingness to destroy those closest to you. These lessons were not abstract theories, but lived realities in a court where royal children regularly disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The religious dimensions of Ptolemaic rule added another layer of complexity to these relationships. The pharaohs of Egypt had traditionally been viewed as living gods, and the Ptolemies maintained this fiction, even as they remained essentially Greek. Royal marriage thus became not merely political alliance, but religious ceremony uniting divine beings whose offspring would inherit the god's favor. This ideology provided powerful justification for practices that would have been abhorrent in ordinary families. Cleopatra II's first marriage to her brother Ptolemy VI followed established dynastic precedent, but occurred under unusually tumultuous circumstances. The young couple ascended to co-rule around 180 BC when Cleopatra II was barely 20 years old. Their marriage was initially a joint kingship with their younger brother Ptolemy VIII, creating an unstable triumvirate that would soon collapse into civil war. The early years of this marriage revealed both the potential benefits and inherent contradictions of the Ptolemaic system. Ptolemy VI was reportedly a more moderate ruler than many of his predecessors, and contemporary sources suggest that his relationship with Cleopatra's sect began with genuine affection. They produced several children, including a son who would become Ptolemy VII and daughters, whose fates would later become central to the dynasty's horror. However, the presence of Ptolemy VI as co-ruler created constant tension. Egyptian succession law was ambiguous regarding multiple siblings, and each brother could claim equal legitimacy. Ptolemy VII, known to history as Fiscon Fat Belly, was reportedly jealous of his older brother's primary position and actively plotted against him. This family drama played out against the backdrop of Roman expansion into the eastern Mediterranean, with different factions seeking foreign support for their claims. The first major crisis came when Antiochus IV of Syria invaded Egypt in 169 BC, exploiting the internal divisions within the royal family. The brothers initially united against the foreign threat, but their cooperation proved temporary. Antiochus captured Memphis and declared himself pharaoh, forcing the royal family to flee to Alexandria. During this crisis, Cleopatra II demonstrated the political acumen that would characterize her long reign, helping coordinate resistance against the Syrian occupation. Roman intervention eventually forced Antiochus to withdraw, but the crisis had permanently damaged relationships within the royal family. Ptolemy VII had used the chaos to build his own power base, gathering supporters who believed he would be a stronger ruler than his brother. The stage was set for the civil war that would define the next phase of Cleopatra II's life. The deteriorating political situation placed enormous strain on Cleopatra II's marriage. As queen, she was expected to support her husband's policies while managing her own court faction. Ancient sources suggest she possessed considerable political skill, serving as an intermediary between competing court factions. Yet she was also a mother, trying to protect her children in an environment where royal offspring were routinely murdered by relatives seeking to eliminate potential rivals. By the mid-160s BCE, the kingdom was effectively split between supporters of the two brothers. Ptolemy VI controlled Alexandria and Lower Egypt, while Ptolemy VII held significant territory in Upper Egypt. Cleopatra found herself at the center of this conflict, her loyalty to her husband increasingly complicated by the growing power of her brother-in-law and the practical necessities of survival in a fracturing kingdom. Ptolemy VI's death in 145 BCE during a campaign in Syria marked a turning point not just in Cleopatra II's personal life, but in the moral trajectory of the entire dynasty. The circumstances of his death remain disputed by historians, with some ancient sources suggesting he died in battle while others hint at assassination. What is certain is that his death left Cleopatra II in an impossibly vulnerable position, a widow with young children in a court where family members routinely murdered each other for political advantage. The immediate succession crisis revealed the true nature of Ptolemaic family dynamics. Ptolemy VI had left a young son, Ptolemy VII, who was technically the legitimate heir. However, the boy was only a child, and in the brutal politics of Hellenistic kingdoms, child rulers rarely survived long. Cleopatra II faced an agonizing choice: attempt to rule as regent for her son, knowing this would likely result in both their deaths, or accept the inevitable and negotiate with Ptolemy VIII. Ptolemy VII moved quickly to consolidate power, demonstrating the calculated ruthlessness that would characterize his reign. Within months of his brother's death, he had eliminated most potential rivals, including the young Ptolemy fam. Ancient sources describe the child's murder in chilling terms. He was reportedly killed in his mother's arms during what was supposed to be a wedding ceremony uniting the royal family. This act of infanticide, shocking even by Ptolemaic standards, announced Ptolemy VI's willingness to cross any moral boundary to secure his throne. For Cleopatra II, the murder of her son represented not just personal tragedy, but political calculation taken to its logical extreme. She was forced to witness the destruction of her child as the price of her own survival. The psychological impact of this trauma would influence all her subsequent decisions, creating a woman who understood that in the Ptolemaic court, love was weakness and mercy was suicide. The forced marriage between Cleopatra VI and Ptolemy VIII that followed represented the complete subordination of human relationships to political necessity. Ancient sources make clear that this was not a union born of affection or even pragmatic alliance, but a brutal assertion of power designed to legitimize Ptolemy VI's usurpation while ensuring Cleopatra II's compliance. She became both queen and hostage, her status dependent entirely on her willingness to serve her sons. Murder, the wedding ceremonies, conducted with all the traditional pomp of Ptolemaic royal marriages, masked the horror of the underlying reality. Cleopatra II, now in her 40s, was compelled to share the bed of the man who had destroyed her previous family, while presenting a facade of willing participation to the Egyptian people. Contemporary accounts suggest she maintained her dignity throughout this ordeal, but the psychological cost was enormous. Ptolemy VII's reign quickly revealed itself as one of the most oppressive in Egyptian history. He purged the intellectual community of Alexandria, driving scholars and artists into exile. He imposed crushing taxes on the population while enriching his supporters through corruption and violence. Most horrifically for Cleopatra II, he began systematically eliminating anyone with potential claims to the throne, including distant relatives and their children. The most grotesque chapter in Cleopatra II's life began around 140 BCE when Ptolemy VII took an additional wife, Cleopatra III, who was simultaneously Cleopatra II's daughter and Ptolemy VI's stepdaughter and niece. This marriage represented the ultimate perversion of family relationships. Even by Ptolemaic standards, it was not merely incest, but a deliberate humiliation designed to demonstrate Ptolemy VIII's absolute power over the women in his family. Ancient sources provide disturbing details about how this arrangement was implemented. Cleopatra II was not simply displaced as primary queen, but forced to participate in ceremonies recognizing her daughter as co-wife. The psychological torture involved in compelling a mother to accept her daughter's sexual subjugation to her own husband reveals the sadistic creativity that absolute power can inspire. Ptolemy VIII understood that physical violence, while effective, was less devastating than moral destruction. The age difference between Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra III made the arrangement even more disturbing. Contemporary calculations suggest that Cleopatra III was barely 20 when the marriage was formalized, while Ptolemy VII was approaching 50. The young woman had grown up calling him stepfather, creating layers of psychological violation that extended far beyond the mere fact of incest. She was simultaneously daughter, stepdaughter, niece, and wife to the same man. For the Egyptian people, this marriage represented a new low in royal degeneracy. While sibling marriage had become accepted as Ptolemaic tradition, the marriage of stepfather to stepdaughter crossed cultural boundaries that even the most cynical subjects found difficult to accept. Contemporary papyri reveal growing popular resentment against the royal family, with some Egyptian priests refusing to perform traditional ceremonies honoring the pharaoh's marriages. The practical implications of this arrangement created immediate tensions within the court. Cleopatra retained her titles and ceremonial position, but her authority was systematically undermined by her daughter's elevation. Palace intrigue became even more Byzantine as courtiers attempted to navigate relationships between queens who were simultaneously mother and daughter, rivals and allies. The children produced by both marriages created competing claims to succession that would plague the dynasty for generations. The psychological impact on Cleopatra II was devastating. Ancient sources describe her becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid, unsure whether her own daughter remained loyal or had become another tool in Ptolemy VI's campaign of psychological warfare. The natural affection between mother and daughter was weaponized, turned into an instrument of mutual destruction that served the king's interests while devastating both women's emotional well-being. Most disturbing of all, Cleopatra VII was expected to maintain the fiction that this arrangement was normal and beneficial for the kingdom. she continued to appear at public ceremonies, to participate in religious rituals, and to present herself as a willing participant in the royal marriage system. The gap between public performance and private reality created a form of existential torture that few human beings could sustain indefinitely. The birth of Ptolemy Memphites around 135 BCE to Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VII represented both hope and danger in equal measure. For Cleopatra II, this son offered the possibility of redemption, a chance to raise a child who might survive the brutal dynamics of Ptolemaic court life. For Ptolemy VI, the boy represented both the continuation of his bloodline and a potential future threat to his absolute authority. In the twisted logic of Ptolemaic politics, the child was simultaneously precious and expendable. The early years of Ptolemy Memphites' life unfolded against the backdrop of increasing tensions between his parents. Cleopatra II's relationship with Ptolemy VI had never recovered from the murder of her first son, and the presence of Cleopatra III as co-wife created additional sources of conflict. The young prince became both a symbol of these tensions and an innocent victim of forces beyond his comprehension or control. Ancient sources describe Ptolemy Memphites as an intelligent and promising child, qualities that may have ultimately sealed his fate. In a dynasty where competent heirs were often viewed as threats to aging rulers, the boy's capabilities marked him for destruction. Ptolemy, now in his 50s and increasingly paranoid about succession, began to view his own son through the lens of political calculation rather than paternal affection. The breaking point came during the civil war that erupted in 132 BCE, when Cleopatra II finally rebelled against her husband's increasingly intolerable rule. The conflict split the kingdom between Alexandria, which supported Cleopatra II, and Memphis, which remained loyal to Ptolemy VI. For several years, Egypt was torn apart by warfare between the two sides, with both claiming legitimate authority to rule. During this conflict, Ptolemy VII committed an act that shocked even his supporters. He murdered his son, Ptolemy Memphites, and sent the dismembered body to Cleopatra II as a birthday present. Ancient historians describe this deed with unusual emotional detail, suggesting that even hardened observers of Hellenistic politics found it particularly abhorrent. The murder was not committed in the heat of battle or as an act of momentary rage, but as a calculated psychological weapon designed to break his wife's will to resist. The method of the murder and the subsequent mutilation of the child's body revealed the depths of cruelty that absolute power could inspire. Ptolemy ensured that Cleopatra II would understand not just that her son was dead, but that his death had been deliberately torturous. The timing of the delivery on her birthday added an additional layer of psychological sadism, ensuring that any future anniversary would be forever associated with this ultimate trauma. The psychological impact on Cleopatra II was immediate and devastating. Contemporary sources describe her collapse in a grief so profound that she temporarily lost the ability to function as a political leader. Her supporters began to question whether she could continue the struggle against Ptolemy VI, while her enemies interpreted her reaction as confirmation of feminine weakness unsuited to royal authority. The civil war that erupted between Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII in 132 BCE represented more than a simple succession dispute. It was a fundamental confrontation between two visions of Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra's set, supported by the Alexandrian aristocracy and much of the native Egyptian population, represented a return to more traditional forms of royal authority. Ptolemy VIII, backed by mercenary forces, and rural power brokers embodied the evolution of Hellenistic kingship toward pure autocracy, unrestrained by law or custom. The initial phases of the conflict favored Cleopatra II, who controlled Alexandria and most of Lower Egypt. Her supporters included many intellectuals and priests who had been alienated by Ptolemy VI's brutal policies. The famous Library of Alexandria became a center of resistance, with scholars and philosophers providing ideological support for her cause. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the cycle of Ptolemaic violence might be broken by a queen who represented civilization against barbarism. However, Ptolemy VI's superior military resources and willingness to employ extreme violence gradually shifted the balance of power. He recruited extensively among foreign mercenaries who had no emotional investment in Egyptian affairs and could be relied upon to carry out orders, regardless of their moral implications. These forces proved particularly effective against Cleopatra II's supporters, who were fighting as much for ideological principles as for political advantage. The murder of Ptolemy Memphites marked the turning point in the war, not merely because of its psychological impact on Cleopatra II, but because it demonstrated Ptolemy VI's complete abandonment of traditional royal restraints. Ancient sources describe how the news of the child's death spread throughout Egypt, creating horror even among Ptolemy VI's supporters. Many began to question whether victory was worth association with such monstrous acts. The siege of Alexandria that followed represented one of the most brutal episodes in ancient Egyptian history. Ptolemy VI's forces systematically destroyed the city's infrastructure while targeting intellectuals and cultural leaders for elimination. The famous museum was ransacked, with many irreplaceable manuscripts destroyed or scattered. Scholars who had made Alexandria the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world fled to Rome, Rhodes, and other cities, never to return. For Cleopatra X, trapped in the besieged city, the gradual collapse of resistance must have been agonizing to witness. She watched as her supporters were systematically eliminated, as the cultural achievements of 3 centuries were destroyed, and as the kingdom her ancestors had built was transformed into a wasteland of fear and oppression. The woman who had once been one of the most powerful people in the Mediterranean world found herself reduced to a fugitive in her own capital. The final stages of the siege saw Cleopatra II's position become increasingly desperate. Food supplies dwindled while disease spread through the crowded city. Her remaining supporters began to negotiate secretly with Ptolemy VII, seeking terms that might preserve their lives, if not their political positions. The queen found herself increasingly isolated, sustained only by the knowledge that surrender would likely mean death or something worse. The reconciliation between Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VII in 124 BCE represented not forgiveness or political compromise, but the complete triumph of pragmatic brutality over human dignity. After nearly a decade of civil war, both sides faced pressures that made continued conflict unsustainable. For Ptolemy VII, the economic devastation of Egypt threatened his ability to pay his mercenary armies, while Roman pressure demanded a stable ally in the eastern Mediterranean. For Cleopatra, the choice had become stark: accept reconciliation or face certain death. The negotiations that led to this reconciliation reveal the cynical calculations that governed Ptolemaic politics. Ancient sources make clear that neither party harbored any illusions about the other's intentions. Ptolemy VII offered Cleopatra II a return to her royal status, not out of magnanimity, but because he needed her legitimacy to stabilize his rule. She accepted not because she had forgiven the murder of her son, but because the alternative was the complete destruction of everything she had fought to preserve. The terms of the reconciliation were deliberately humiliating for Cleopatra II. She was forced to publicly acknowledge Ptolemy VII's authority and to accept her daughter Cleopatra III's continued status as co-wife. More devastatingly, she was required to participate in ceremonies honoring the memory of Ptolemy Memphites while pretending that his death had been a tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. The psychological torture involved in these requirements demonstrated Ptolemy VII's understanding that mere political submission was insufficient. He demanded the complete destruction of his opponent's inner dignity. The public ceremonies celebrating the reconciliation were carefully orchestrated to present a facade of family unity while maintaining the underlying power dynamics that favored Ptolemy. Cleopatra II appeared alongside her husband and daughter, playing the role of willing participant in the restored royal harmony. Contemporary accounts suggest that she performed these duties with remarkable self-control, never allowing public observers to glimpse the hatred and grief that must have consumed her. Private thoughts, the return to court life subjected Cleopatra II to daily reminders of her powerlessness and loss. She was surrounded by courtiers who had supported Ptolemy VII during the Civil War, many of whom had participated in the violence against her supporters. She was expected to interact cordially with people who had enabled or celebrated the murder of her son. The psychological endurance required to maintain these relationships reveals the extraordinary human capacity for survival under even the most unbearable circumstances. The presence of Cleopatra III as co-wife added another layer of complexity to these already tortured relationships. The young woman was simultaneously Cleopatra's daughter and her rival for royal authority. Ancient sources suggest that the relationship between mother and daughter had been irreparably damaged by the events of the Civil War, creating a family dynamic where natural affection had been completely subordinated to political calculation. For the Egyptian people, the reconciliation represented the final proof that their rulers had abandoned any pretense of moral authority. The spectacle of a mother forced to reconcile with her son's murderer while accepting her daughter as co-wife to the same man revealed the complete corruption of royal authority. Contemporary papyri show increasing religious and cultural resistance to Ptolemaic rule, with many Egyptians turning to alternative sources of spiritual and political legitimacy. The practical arrangements of the reconciliation required Cleopatra II to live in close proximity to people she had every reason to hate and fear. Palace life became an elaborate performance where every interaction was carefully choreographed to maintain the fiction of royal harmony. The queen, who had once commanded armies and governed provinces, found herself reduced to a ceremonial figure whose primary function was to legitimize her husband's authority through her presence and apparent consent. The last decades of Cleopatra II's life, from her forced reconciliation in 124 BCE until her death around 116 BCE, represent a prolonged study in the corrosive effects of psychological trauma on human dignity. No longer an active political force, she became a living symbol of Ptolemaic brutality, a woman whose very presence at court served as a reminder of what absolute power could accomplish when freed from moral restraints. Her daily existence was a careful balance between maintaining the appearance of royal dignity and managing the constant reminders of her losses and humiliations. Ancient sources from this period describe a woman who had aged far beyond her years, her health deteriorating under the constant stress of court life. The physical manifestations of psychological trauma were evident too. Contemporary observers who noted her increasing withdrawal from public ceremonies and her obvious discomfort during family gatherings. Yet she continued to fulfill her ceremonial duties, understanding that any sign of rebellion or even passive resistance would likely result in her death. The birth of additional children to Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra III during this period created new sources of pain for Cleopatra II. She was expected to treat these half-siblings of her murdered son as beloved family members, participating in their naming ceremonies and educational planning while privately grieving for the child who had been torn from her arms decades earlier. The juxtaposition of new life with remembered death created a form of emotional torture that few human beings could endure indefinitely. Court ceremonies during this period took on an increasingly surreal quality, with elaborate rituals designed to celebrate Ptolemaic family unity while carefully avoiding any reference to the violence that had created the current arrangement. Cleopatra II's participation in these events required her to perform a version of herself that bore little resemblance to her inner reality. She became an actress in her own life, playing the role of contented queen while dying slowly from spiritual wounds that could never heal. The intellectual isolation that accompanied her political marginalization may have been equally devastating. As a young woman, Cleopatra II had been part of Alexandria's vibrant scholarly community, engaging with philosophers, historians, and scientists who made the city a center of Mediterranean learning. The purges that followed Ptolemy VII's victory had scattered or killed most of these figures, leaving her surrounded by courtiers whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than intellectual achievement. Religious observances became one of the few areas where Cleopatra II could express something approaching authentic emotion. Ancient sources describe her increasing devotion to Egyptian cults associated with death and resurrection, particularly the worship of Isis. These religious practices may have provided both psychological comfort and a socially acceptable outlet for grief that could not be expressed in political contexts. Her patronage of temple restoration projects in her later years suggest a woman seeking some form of meaning beyond the boundaries of court politics. The gradual deterioration of her relationship with Cleopatra III created additional emotional complications. The daughter who had once been her greatest comfort had become a symbol of her greatest defeat. Ancient sources hint at tensions between the two queens that occasionally erupted into public disagreements, quickly suppressed by palace officials concerned about maintaining the fiction of family harmony. The natural love between mother and daughter had been weaponized so effectively that neither woman could express affection without risking political consequences. Medical knowledge from the period was insufficient to understand the long-term effects of severe psychological trauma, but contemporary descriptions of Cleopatra II's final years suggest symptoms that modern physicians would recognize as severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. She reportedly suffered from insomnia, loss of appetite, and episodes of what ancient writers described as melancholy, madness, periods when she became unable to participate in normal court activities due to overwhelming grief and anxiety. The death of Cleopatra around 116 BC marked not just the end of an individual life, but the symbolic conclusion of an experiment in absolute power that had consumed an entire civilization. Her funeral, conducted with all the traditional honors of Ptolemaic royalty, represented the ultimate triumph of appearance over reality. A magnificent ceremony honoring a woman whose life had been systematically destroyed by the very system the ceremony was designed to celebrate. The immediate aftermath of her death revealed the extent to which the Ptolemaic system had corrupted every aspect of royal governance, rather than serving as an occasion for reflection on the moral costs of dynastic violence. Cleopatra II's passing simply created new opportunities for succession disputes. Her surviving children and stepchildren began maneuvering for position within hours of her death, demonstrating that the lessons of her suffering had been completely lost on those who might have learned from them. The broader implications of the Ptolemaic experiment became increasingly apparent in the decades following Cleopatra II's death. The systematic destruction of human relationships within the royal family had created a ruling class incapable of forming the stable alliances necessary for effective governance. Each generation of rulers was weaker than the last, more paranoid, more violent, and less capable of inspiring loyalty among their subjects. The dynasty that had once rivaled Rome in power and cultural achievement was rapidly becoming a client state dependent on foreign protection. The cultural legacy of Ptolemaic family practices extended far beyond the immediate royal circle. Egyptian society, exposed to 3 centuries of royal incest and violence, had become desensitized to forms of behavior that earlier generations would have found abhorrent. Ancient sources describe increasing acceptance of domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual exploitation throughout the kingdom, suggesting that royal example had corroded social norms at every level of society. The economic consequences of Ptolemaic misrule were equally devastating. The civil wars and purges that characterized Cleopatra II's era had destroyed much of Egypt's intellectual and commercial infrastructure. The brain drain that followed Ptolemy VI's persecutions deprived the kingdom of the human capital necessary for innovation and growth. Alexandria, once the economic heart of the Eastern Mediterranean, became increasingly irrelevant as commerce shifted to Rome and other rising centers. Perhaps most significantly, the Ptolemaic system had demonstrated the ultimate futility of attempting to preserve power through bloodline purity, rather than creating a dynasty of divine rulers. 3 centuries of incest had produced increasingly unstable and incompetent monarchs. The very practice that was supposed to preserve royal excellence had become the mechanism of its destruction, creating rulers so isolated from normal human experience that they could no longer function effectively in the complex political environment of the holistic world. The psychological toll on individual rulers had been equally catastrophic. Cleopatra II's story was not unique, but representative of countless royal children who had been raised to view their closest family members as potential threats and marriage partners. The system had created human beings incapable of forming normal emotional attachments, doomed to lives of isolation, paranoia, and violence. The personal tragedies that filled Ptolemaic history were not accidents, but inevitable products of a system that prioritized political calculation over human development. International observers of the period recognized that the Ptolemaic experiment had become an object lesson in the dangers of unchecked power. Roman historians, like Polybius, used Egyptian examples to warn their own readers about the corrupting effects of absolute authority. The Ptolemies became synonymous with dynastic degeneracy, their family practices cited as evidence of what happened when rulers freed themselves from legal and moral constraints. As we reach the end of Cleopatra II's story, we confront truths about human nature and political power that remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Alexandria. Her life serves as a stark reminder that the greatest horrors in Human history often emerged not from random violence or natural disaster, but from the systematic application of human intelligence to the service of absolute power. The Ptolemaic dynasty's 3th-century experiment in royal incest and family violence represents one of history's most thorough demonstrations of how political systems can transform natural human relationships into instruments of oppression and control. The particular tragedy of Cleopatra II lies not in the fact that she suffered, but in how completely her suffering was integrated into a functioning political system. She was not the victim of random cruelty or individual madness, but of institutional arrangements that made her torment inevitable and necessary for the preservation of royal authority. Her murder was not a monster acting outside social norms, but a king fulfilling the logical requirements of a system that prioritized political survival over human dignity. The mechanisms that enabled her destruction, the ideology of bloodline purity, the normalization of family violence, the transformation of children into political assets continue to appear in different forms throughout human history. While we may congratulate ourselves on having moved beyond the crude brutalities of ancient dynasties, the underlying patterns of behavior that made Cleopatra II's suffering possible remain embedded in human nature and political structures. The willingness to sacrifice individual human beings for abstract political goals, the reduction of family relationships to calculations of power and advantage, the use of ideology to justify practices that common morality would condemn. These tendencies appear wherever human beings organize themselves into hierarchical systems of authority. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that the Ptolemaic system was not simply imposed through violence, but maintained through the active participation of its victims. Cleopatra II's ultimate reconciliation with her son's murder demonstrates how even the most fundamental human emotions can be overcome by the practical necessities of survival in systems that offer no alternatives to compliance. Her final years remind us that human beings possess an almost unlimited capacity for adaptation to circumstances that should be unendurable, a capacity that can serve both survival and the perpetuation of injustice. The broader lesson of her story extends beyond individual psychology to encompass the social and cultural factors that enable systematic oppression. The Egyptian population that witnessed royal incest and child murder without effective resistance had been gradually conditioned to accept these practices through centuries of normalization, the process by which extreme behavior becomes acceptable to entire populations remains one of the most important and terrifying aspects of human social organization, with implications that extend far beyond ancient history into our contemporary political landscape. Yet even in the darkness of Cleopatra II's story, we can find elements that affirm human dignity and resilience. Her initial resistance to Ptolemy VIII's tyranny, her years of civil war against impossible odds, and her maintenance of personal dignity even in final defeat demonstrate that the human spirit retains the capacity for resistance even under the most crushing circumstances. While she ultimately lost her political struggle, her example continues to testify against the systems of power that destroyed her and countless others like her. The enduring relevance of her story lies in its demonstration that progress in human civilization is neither automatic nor irreversible. The same intellectual and technological achievements that made Alexandria a wonder of the ancient world coexisted with family practices that we would now consider evidence of severe psychological pathology. the capacity for both remarkable achievement and appalling cruelty within the same individuals and institutions serves as a permanent warning against moral complacency and the assumption that cultural advancement necessarily produces ethical improvement. As we close this examination of one of history's darkest royal courts, we are left with a sobering recognition that the forces that shaped Cleopatra II's tragedy remain active in our own world. The challenge for each generation is to identify and resist these tendencies before they achieve the institutional permanence that made Ptolemaic horrors seem normal and inevitable to those who lived within their system. Her story endures, not as ancient history, but as a contemporary warning about the eternal human capacity for transforming political power into an instrument of systematic cruelty against those least able to resist its application.